Good to be with you this afternoon. I nearly didn't make it, but I'm glad I'm here. No doubt many of you have noticed that we're getting older. I think we need to be clear about the distinction between being elderly and being elders. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi says, on the one hand, the elderly are often plagued by a gradually mounting sense of alienation, loneliness, and social uselessness. So they age without saging. On the other hand, elders, while aging, go through a process of conscious and deliberate growth, becoming sages who are capable of guiding their families and communities with hard-earned wisdom. If you want a harsh, hyper-realistic, unromantic picture of becoming elderly, read Ecclesiastes. Schachter Shalomi's translation reads as follows: "Then come the creaking days. Years creep up in which one feels like saying, I have no taste for them. For the sunlight darkens in the eyes, dimmed is the light of the moon and the stars, and the vision is patchy like a cloudy sky after rain. The hands and arms, the guards of the house begin to tremble, and the legs, like battle-tired soldiers, are unsure in their step. The grinding mills, the teeth are fewer, and the windows of the mind fog up, and the back is bent, and the urge to mate is weakened as a person walks to his eternal home." Ain't that the truth? But it ain't the whole truth. Jean Houston, director of the Foundation for Mind Research and author of the book Life Force, says the years beyond 60, the years of our second maturity, may be evolution's greatest gift to humanity. No longer needing to compete and to be acceptable, likable, and all those other things considered respectable in society, people are finally uncaged in their elder years, free to release energies and capacities that the culture restrained in them when they were younger. The energies that people release after the age of 65 are not really new at all, but exist in a state of latency within the mind-body system. When we don't have to devote a large percentage of our time in fulfilling social obligations and meeting other people's expectations, we can unleash these energies and harness them for self-awareness, spiritual development, and creativity. Hence, Rabbi Alman says, and I say to my children and grandchildren, the Bible is lavish in its praise for elders. It considers grey hair a crown of glory and wrinkles a mark of distinction. The book of Leviticus instructs us in how to honour elders, whether they are scholars or unlettered, says Rabbi Zalman. Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honour the face of the older person. The book of Exodus reaffirms this view. Honour thy father and mother, that thy days may be long in the land which the Lord thy God has given thee. Interestingly enough, that's the only commandment in the 10 Commandments where there's a rationale for the commandment, saying that if you respect your elders and learn from your elders, there's a chance you'll live long in the land. If you don't learn from them, maybe you won't have such an opportunity to live a full life. Thankfully, Ange and I both had mothers and fathers who were traditional elders in their respective religious communities. Anthropologist Joan Halifax says elders in traditional society show us the developmental possibilities of old age. These mature individuals who have distilled wisdom from experience have become innocent, clear-seeing, and compassionate. These elders serve as storytellers who spin webs of enchanted verbal magic that help people understand their place in the cosmos. When elders tell us stories, we see through our superficial picture of reality into the deeper meaning of life. She says those sacred stories reconnect us to our depths, revealing our origins, our hopes, and our destinies. Through their compassionate relatedness to all of life, they reduce our sense of alienation by helping us rediscover our sacred roots. And that is exactly what our mothers and fathers, as our elders, did for us, for Ange and I. We were both brought up in homes where our parents lived out the sacred story of God's love. Frank and Margaret Andrews and James and Athena Bellis were shining examples of a compassionate relatedness to all life. Their lives were open, not closed, hospitable to all those that are around them. And as they made time and space for God, they made time and space for the people about whom God passionately cares. So Ange and I have unashamedly, but not slavishly, tried to copy our parents, and also tried to set a similar example of divinely inspired human compassion for our children. The best decision that Ange and I ever made was in the selection of our parents. Having benefited from the inspirational example of our parents as elders, Ange and I have made it our policy, whenever we have gone somewhere, to find others, elders, 20 years older than us, who modelled lives that we wanted to be able to emulate in 20 years' time. In the early days, Charles and Rita Ringmer were models for Ange and I, and we wanted to be like them in 20 years' time. So we thought of their example of life, the way they lived out hospitality in South Brisbane, the way they engaged people in the streets, and that was a model that inspired us, and we tried to replicate. Let me just say this, I think it's very important. Ange and I have always thought it was smart to learn from our own mistakes, but wise to learn from our elders, so to avoid making as many unnecessary mistakes as possible. Because all mistakes involve pain, and managing mistakes involves more pain. And it's better to avoid the unnecessary pain so we have the capacity to deal with the inevitable, unavoidable pain as best we can. And it was by watching people like Charles and Rita Ringmer engage with people on the margins of society, we learned how to engage people with serious dysfunction, and to do that in a way that didn't avoid risks, but minimised some of the risks that we would have otherwise taken heedlessly. When Ange and I went to Delhi, we met another couple, Ray and Gwen Windsor, who adopted us into their wonderful extended family, supporting us as we settled in to the city and providing help whenever we needed it. Ray and Gwen were 20 years older than us. They were the leaders of Interserve, and they were fine older people who set a great example for us there. We used to meet with them regularly, staying in their homes when we could for a break from the intentional community we were involved with, and we constantly were able to talk over the issues that we were facing, that they, as missionaries in India for 20 years or more before we got there, were able to help us reflect on in a way that was really constructive. When we left India and came back to Australia, Frank and Val Garlick were people who became elders for us, 20 years older than us. They'd lived and worked in India and Nepal for many years, and were the kind of people that we wanted to be like as we grew older. And so over the last 20 or 30 years, we have tried to stay in touch with Frank and Val, to meet them regularly, as indeed Bob Cunningham has, until recently. It's only now that Frank is becoming so frail it's not possible. In fact, the challenge now is to find people 20 years older than us who still have the energy to relate to us. We're running out of them, I think. But we have been greatly privileged to have elders in our lives who have modelled a way of life that we have sought to emulate, and who we've been able to meet with regularly and talk about the issues that we were facing in a way that was nurturing and encouraging. Now, when my older daughter had her daughter, I became keenly aware of the significance of moving from being a father to being a grandfather. I was aware of the same joy of welcoming our granddaughter Lilla into our family as there was when we welcomed our daughter Yvonne, now known as Ruby, into our family. But I was aware that my role in nurturing my granddaughter would be very different from my role in nurturing my daughter. It would be a secondary role, not a primary role. In fact, probably the last 5 or 10 years, I've found out I've been best to operate in that role as the extended family Uber driver, as I've run people to and fro to their meetings and been able to have conversations about life along the way. And not a primary role, a secondary role, but one that's been very meaningful. You may ask, as I've become older, I have been exploring what it means for me to assume a secondary role rather than a primary role, and do some eldering, not only in my family, but in my community. You may ask, why do I use to elder as a verb? Indeed, some of you who love the grammar of our language dearly may want to scream at yet another excruciating example of the modern trend of verbing. That is, inexcusably turning yet another noun into a verb. But Rabbi Zalman insists there is some excuse. He says, eldering for me is a process word, a verb that connotes change. It doesn't connote the unchanging, fixed state of a noun. When we call someone a senior, for example, the noun points to a static, lifeless condition. It's as if it's a state called senior that has been attained and all further organic growth has ceased. But when I refer to someone as eldering, the ing in the word refers to a state of growth, a process with endless possibilities. Eldering implies that we take active responsibility for our destiny in old age, living by conscious choice rather than social expectation. As I've thought about, I have become convinced that what the good rabbi encourages to call eldering, for me, is less formal and more familiar, but a lot like what we might call coaching. A few years ago, I left the community that I live in for a while to go on a sabbatical. And when I returned, I asked some of my friends whether my absence from the community had made any difference. They said it had. When I asked them in what way they had missed me, my friend Neil, who loves football, said, "We didn't miss you as a player. We can play the game well enough by ourselves, but I guess we missed you as a coach." Ever since then, I've tried to be mindful of the fact, at this stage of life, people need me less to be a player and more of a coach, more like a contemporary life coach, as it were. Eldering, like coaching, is not authoritarian. It's not about giving directions or advice. It's about encouraging people to develop their own authority themselves, as authors of their own ideas, their own words, and their own deeds. Eldering, like coaching, is not instructional. It's not about preaching or about teaching. It subscribes to no prescribed curriculum and issues no set decrees. It may or may not be religious, but it's always spiritual. Spirituality is about life lived at depth, and eldering is about encouraging people to get in touch with what they think and how they feel in the very depths of their soul. Both eldering and coaching at their best are about helping people discover their vocation. Vocation is not a call to be like someone else, whom we might hold up as an ideal, but to be true to our real selves, whom we are created to be. However, while coaches may be professional, elders are amateurs. The concept of an amateur comes from the Latin word amator, which in English means love. And in this context, it means someone who does something for the love of it. While a professional is a paid role, the amateur is not paid at all. Those of us who choose to elder the emerging generation, seeking to nurture generative and regenerative engagement in our world, do it for the love of it. Now, even those of us who choose to be elders are not always elders. Sometimes we're somewhat quite crotchety, elderly people. But I know from my own experience we can be renewed in our love to do the inner work we need to overcome our own inertia and recover our charism to be elders. And we can do that again and again and again. When my dear friend Martin Rowe, a poet priest, introduced me to an audience at Greenbelt, he said, "I like to think of Dave Andrews as a weirdy, beardy, proverbially wise old, kind old, beslippered, fireside, snoothy, fierceless storytelling, grandfatherly, rugged tribal leader. And I'd like to think that on a good day, that might be so." Let me tell you how I engage the church as an amateur elder rather than as a professional cleric. Most clergy I know are aware that though I am a Christian anarchist and totally opposed to ordination because I believe it is elitist and detrimentally exclusive to the laity, that I am supportive of clergy as people. A few years ago, my friend Justin Duckworth was appointed as the Anglican Bishop of Wellington in New Zealand. I sent him a text saying that, I can't imagine Jesus ever wearing purple. After all, purple is an imperial colour. But if anyone can bring the Spirit of Jesus to this role, you can. He used to say publicly that I was the only one of all the hundreds of people who contacted him that did not congratulate him. But one of the first things he did as a bishop was to invite me to come to help his clergy in Wellington think about how they could minister in their churches with unaffected, heartfelt vulnerability. Justin knew that in spite of my reservations about ordination, he could trust me to treat his clergy unreservedly well. And that was a great honour to be invited to do that. These days, I facilitate the local ministers' meetings in our area. We don't call it a fraternal like they used to, because thankfully, the meeting includes females as well as males. Our group includes Anglican, Uniting, Evangelical, Charismatic, and Catholic clergy. And believe it or not, an excommunicated Catholic priest. So the fact that I'm not ordained is a comparatively inconsequential matter. In the ministers' meeting, we assiduously avoid any formal, institutional, denominational emphases. Instead, we intentionally emphasise an informal, personal, relational approach from beginning to end. We start with check-ins, then pick up any personal concerns people have. Occasionally, as coordinator, I will ask an open question about what personal challenges people are facing and what personal approaches they have found helpful in overcoming those challenges, and so on. We discourage people from promoting pet subjects, sectarian agendas, and theological debates. Rather, we keep the tone generous, gentle, and easygoing, allowing the interaction to move back and forward from the light, humorous, superficial exchanges to heavy, heartfelt, in-depth conversations. Consequently, all the ministers, including the Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Catholic priests in the group, whose ethnic, national and ecclesiastical affiliations are currently at war with one another, say that the group is so safe, accepting, respectful and supportive and encouraging that it is by far the best ministers' meeting that they have ever been a part of. Some of the ministers who've actually moved on out of the area, like Alan Moore and Ian, still come back to that meeting because they say they love the meeting so much that it's very encouraging for them and they don't want to miss it. The ministers' meeting is more a fellowship group than an organising group, but different ministers will help each other and share resources with each other and invite others to join with them around specific activities. The joint ecumenical activity, which most ministers choose to get their members involved in, is the very moving, spiritually sensitive, socially relevant public Stations of the Cross event that the Uniting Church conducts in the main street of our neighbourhood on Good Fridays. Many of us here value that gathering because it's so contrary to the triumphalistic Easter marches. The whole approach is to go around our neighbourhood as penitent pilgrims, looking at the places in our neighbourhood that represent places where Christ is still crucified today. And we go and stop in those places and we pray. And as it's a humble, vulnerable approach to entering into the Easter story in the context of our area, a whole lot of people gather on the sides of the streets or stop us or talk to us along the way and enter into some of these reflections. Being an amateur elder on the margins of the church life rather than a professional cleric at the centre of church affairs means that I'm in a great position to not only work with people involved in the church, but also work with people alienated by church organs and parachurch organisations. These days I facilitate 2 peer support groups of profoundly disappointed, disillusioned and disenchanted pastors, chaplains, missionaries and other church and parachurch community workers who've been badly damaged by the way religious institutions that they've worked for have treated them. These support groups function much like the ministers' meetings. Culture is primary, structure is secondary. In terms of culture, we emphasise the personal and relational, keeping the tone generous and gentle and easygoing, allowing for that interaction to move back and forward from the light and humorous to the heavy and heartfelt conversations. In terms of structure, we too start with check-ins and pick up any personal concerns people have, but then we focus on one of these points of pain, reflecting on the personal challenges that people are facing and what personal approaches they've found helpful in overcoming those challenges. All the time, discouraging people from trying to fix one another or trying to give one another advice, but instead encouraging the person who's the focus of concern to trust the Spirit, to be an inner guide, to lead them into the truth that others can affirm and confirm in their own experience, including one person in the group who used to be the principal of a theological college who has subsequently lost his faith in God, who finds that the way the group operates allows him to be open to Spirit too. In these support groups, people find a safe space to be brave enough to be honest and honestly acknowledge and creatively engage their anger, doubt and despair. The feedback from participants is that these groups have been very helpful for them. One person said that the group provided him with what he never expected but desperately needed. A sweet, personally transformative disembitterment process. A word that he coined especially for that group. It's a beautiful phrase. I define spirituality as the experience and expression of compassion for the other. I define religion as the ideation of that experience and institutionalization of that expression, which simultaneously affirms and negates the spirit of compassion for the other. Religious eldering, at its worst, encourages subordination of the self to concepts and practices that restrict our experience and expression of compassion for the other outside our religion. However, religious eldering, at its best, encourages emancipation of the self from constructs and structures that restrict our experience and expression of compassion from the other outside of our religion. Spiritual eldering is about encouraging people in all religions to get in touch with what they think and how they feel in the depths of their soul as persons that are made in the image of a compassionate God. Recently, I was invited to help Maulavis in northern Sri Lanka. These are Muslim leaders whose Muslim communities are facing persecution from Buddhist extremists. And they wanted me to help them to get in touch with the depths of their souls, made in the image of a compassionate God, in order to find the spiritual resources they needed to respond constructively rather than react violently to their oppression, and so to avoid another Rohingya-like genocide in South Asia. I was asked to help them reflect on what it means to be a faithful Muslim in a confronting world, how to respond sincerely as Muslims to criticisms from non-Muslims, how to get spiritual guidance from the Quran in a way that avoids the pitfalls of a literalist, Salafist approach, and how to enable co-religionists to develop a capacity to create partnerships with people of other religions other than their own. I encourage them to answer these questions for themselves in the light of the Bismillah. The Bismillah is short for Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which means every surah or chapter in the Quran, except one, starts in the name of God, the most merciful and the most compassionate. I tell them our world is in trouble, and religion, which was made to make things better, has often made things worse. We do not suffer from a lack of religion, but we suffer from a lack of compassion. So if we are to have any hope of survival, we need to find a way to be able to care for ourselves and for others once again. The spirituality of compassion that we recall when we recite the Bismillah is not merely our best hope for true peace on the planet. It is our only hope for real peace on the planet. I asked them how it would affect the way they interpret the Quran if they understood the Bismillah not merely as an introductory invocation, but the key to the interpretation of the text itself. What if they made sure that they approached the text humbly and vulnerably in the spirit of the Bismillah, interpreting the text sympathetically and sensitively in the spirit of the Bismillah, carefully making sure all their interpretations of the text reflected the mercy and grace and compassion of the God in the Bismillah. And I asked them, what difference would it make if they not only began and ended the day praying the Bismillah, but prayed the Bismillah as the prayer of their hearts between actions and reactions in the stressful moments that they face every day? What if they actually prayed the Bismillah as the prayer of their heart and acted out of the spirituality of the Bismillah, responding to the pain with compassion, responding to hatred with love, and responding to violence with non-violence that we find in the Rahman and Rahim? And all of us, of all religions and none, would do well to ask ourselves the same questions. Let me conclude by saying some lessons that I'm learning about eldering as I'm getting older include these. 1, there's a distinction between being elderly and being an elder. 2, we need to accept the problems associated with aging. 3, but we also need to aspire to the possibilities associated with saging. 4, the possibilities of eldering, including encouraging a spirituality of compassion, providing for support, sharing stories, and nurturing generative and regenerative engagement. 5, eldering is like life coaching. It's not so much instructional as invitational, not so much prescriptive as elicitive, helping people to realise their God-given potential. 6, like coaching, eldering involves playing a secondary role rather than a primary role, talking less, listening more, focusing on affirming the actions and the reflections of others. Unlike coaching, eldering is not a paid role, but one played for the love of it, so that those of us who've been in high-flying professional roles need to adapt to under-the-radar roles as amateurs. 8, eldering may not always be religious, but eldering will always be spiritual, inspiring people of all religions and none to trust the spirit of compassion, to be an inner guide to lead them to truth that other people can affirm and confirm in their own experience. 9, the self-effacing, other-enhancing, compassionate spirituality of an elder is beautifully expressed in the exemplary, self-emptying, other-fulfilling, kenotic theology of Christ. 10, the best way for us to learn to be elders is to learn from elders who are Christ-like. Thank you.